Hi everyone and welcome to this drawing video. In this video I want to show you how to draw a waterfall landscape. I'll add some layers of landscape in the background and I'll work my way towards a pool of water with a small waterfall in the foreground. In terms of the materials, I started by using my HB mechanical pencil first, and then later on to add some even darker shading, I was using a regular 6B pencil. For paper, I used smooth Bristol board. To smooth the shading, I was using blending sticks, and finally I used a large eraser to add the mist and a small eraser to add highlights to the water. But please don't worry too much about the equipment. As long as you have any regular pencil and any paper in front of you, you'll be absolutely fine and you'll be able to create something similar to this. As you can see, I started by working on a tiny layer of landscape towards the top left corner, just adding a little bit of ground and a tree, adding some really light shading over the top of it, and then blending over the top with a blending stick. The blending stick was super helpful for this to make sure it looked faded and in the background. Then over the top of all of this, I used my large eraser to tap away and add a layer of mist in front of it. In front of that, I sketched the next layer of landscape with a few more trees, and I started placing some darker shading, a little bit darker than the first layer. My idea for this drawing is to start with the lightest layers in the background, and then as you get closer to the foreground, adding some darker shading. Until finally when you get to the foreground, that's when I'll be using the 6B pencil. Also, as I get closer, I want to start adding more detail as well and more shape. So with this layer, you can see I started building up more shape to the ground. I added branches to the trees and some blades of grass. I also started adding some darker shading towards the top and around the trees, but continued to blend the shading downwards with the blending stick. If you don't have a blending stick, you can make use of a brush or a cotton bud or even your finger. Any of these will work absolutely fine. And then once I was happy with the amount of shading I blended downwards, that's when I used the large eraser to add a layer of mist in front of it. With that mist added, I then placed the next layer of landscape with some darker shading this time and some sharper details, making sure to really show up some of the blades of grass. It was at this point that I also wanted to think about the light source, so then I started placing some shadows from the trees on previous layers. And it's also at this point that you can start to see the shape of the valley that the water has cut. That's why I've angled the landscape in this way. And in the areas where the mist is showing, the water is underneath there, just flowing down the landscape. So I continued by using the large eraser to add some mist in front of the third layer of landscape, and then it was time to work on the next layer in front of that. And at this point we're getting much closer to the foreground, so that's why this layer will require much sharper details and shading. I started by sketching the outlines first, focusing on the shape and making sure that it fits well with the previous layers of background. I added a tree trunk and a tree on the right, focusing more on the details of them as well, adding some branches and a bit more shape, some knots in the wood and details like that. I also wanted to add the water's edge underneath for the pool of water that I wanted to add in the foreground, making sure that this isn't too flat either and adding some interesting shapes to this as well. I added much darker shading on this layer. I started by adding a smooth layer of shading first, and then I used a blending stick over the top of it, and then that's when I started refining some darker shading towards the top of the layer and blended downwards again with the blending stick. I continued that process for all of the layers of grass. For the shading of the trees, I added some dark streaks of shading and blended between them, and then that's when I used the small eraser to add some highlighted edges along the left. And this is actually where I decided to also use the small eraser to add some blades of grass. After that, I decided to sketch the outlines of the foreground, thinking about where the waterfall would be placed and where the water would be falling. I wanted it to be a small waterfall, and I just wanted this scene to be really peaceful. I placed some rocks around there and some bushes and a tree towards the left, thinking about how the dark shading would contrast the highlighted areas of the water. And so with the outlines of the foreground completed, it was time for me to add shading and highlighting to the pool of water above it. So I started by adding a light layer of shading first, and then used a blending stick over the top of that. And then I also placed some darker shading where the water meets the land to show the reflections. And once I was happy with the shading, I then used my small eraser to add some ripples to the water and to add some highlighting along the water's edge. After that, it was time to add shading to the foreground, and I wanted the foreground to be much darker, so that's why I was using my 6B pencil this time. Using the same method for the grass, where I add a layer of shading first, then use a blending stick over the top of it, then continue to use the 6B pencil to refine some details afterwards. When you're working on rocks, the contrast between the highlights and the shadows is super important. I like to start by adding the extremely dark shading towards the bottom first, and then I add a few ridges of dark shading around it, even towards the top. And I use the blending stick to blend between these dark shaded areas to add the mid-tone, and making sure to leave the tops of the rocks completely highlighted. It's also really important not to add any dark outlines around the highlighted areas of the rocks, because in nature, in the real world, you'll never see any dark outlines like that. And I also made use of the small eraser as well to add some highlighted ridges. For the tree trunk on the left, I decided to add some extremely dark shading to contrast the highlighted water, and then I relied on some highlighted edges to define the shape. I also added a couple of bushes to the scene as well, and my process for creating them was to start by adding some texture with the 6B pencil, and then I used the blending stick over the top of that. And then I made use of the small eraser to add some streaks, lots of sharp lines, all in different directions to add leaves, adding some shading to some of these areas as well with the pencil again. And just continuing to refine with lots of sharp details with both the pencil and the small eraser. I just continued to refine these details, making sure to add darker shading as I got closer to the foreground, and then it was time to start working on the shading and the details of the waterfall and the closest pool of water. I added a base layer of shading to the water with my 6B pencil, making sure it was darker than the first pool of water. Then I continued adding some shading in the second pool of water where the water meets the land to add more reflections. Then over the top of everything, I made sure to use my blending stick to keep everything as smooth as possible. To create the effect of the waterfall, I used my small eraser to add some highlights in the direction the water would be flowing. So just adding highlights running all the way down. I also used the eraser across some of the rocks to show where the water would be flowing over them. And this was really helpful in creating the effect that the water is actually flowing over these details, and it helps to add a lot more depth. After that, for the final details of this drawing, I continued using the small eraser to add some ripples to the water, along with some highlights along the water's edge. And after that, this drawing was completed. Overall, it took less than 2 hours to complete in total, and it's such a fun drawing to work on. It's the kind of drawing I love to work on to relax, and I highly recommend giving it a try. I really hope this video helps out in some way, and please let me know what you think in the comments below, and also let me know any suggestions for future drawings you'd like to see. If you want to see more drawings like this, then make sure you're subscribed, and any likes or shares on this video, they really mean a lot to me. If you want to keep updated and see progress photos before I post the videos, then make sure to check out the links in the description box below. Check out my Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And once again, thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for the support. I really loved working on this, and I hope it's helpful. I hope you're having an awesome day, and I'll see you all soon.